So I'm Leif Nelson, and I'm going to moderate the panel, but I'm the least interesting person on stage, so I'll let them speak almost all of the words. The setup that I want to use is I'll briefly introduce everybody here so you know what's going on. Then I'll allow each of them to talk essentially for as long as they want, but it won't be for that long. I have a few questions I want to ask them, but then mostly it's going to be time for you all to ask them questions. Because you can't see it, we have a timer on stage that is already counting down from 75 minutes. At the end of 75 minutes, we will all leave the room, and that'll be it, and then we'll go out there. And Brian will say a few things and make us all energized at the end. Okay. So our four panelists, this session, these are all different versions of journalists, and I'll introduce them, but you will all already know all of them from what they've done. So to my left is Ivan Oransky, who is an MD and affiliated with NYU, but is most notably the founder and leader of Retraction Watch, which, at least from my perspective, went from sort of maybe a subtle niche category to like an incredibly important watchdog entity in all of the concerns that we have. Then it's Christie Aschwanden, who recently authored the book Good to Go, which is very popular and interesting by itself, and is a science journalist. And for this group, perhaps most well known for the work she did when she was with 538, where I think basically encapsulated many of the issues that we've heard about for the last few days and that we all talk about when we're back home in our institutions. And then Richard Harris, who's with NPR and has been a science journalist covering topics from climate change and then more recently into medicine, and wrote the book Rigor Mortis, which basically talks about issues of reproducibility and the reproducibility crisis in medicine. And then finally, Stephanie Lee, another science journalist who was a journalist with The Chronicle and now is with BuzzFeed, and perhaps most notably has done just incredible investigative work into understanding the idiosyncratic and incredibly emblematic case of Brian Wansink. So these are all wonderful panelists. So first, welcome them. And now what I'm going to ask them to do is just going down the road, say, tell us what you think is most interesting, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I want to give credit here because I walked into the conversation outside after our last panel, and I believe it was Richard who said it, maybe it was Steve Goodman who had made the suggestion that what we really should do is just the four of us as journalists. If we could find all the previous panelists and get them back on stage, we have some questions. So
more than one.
Yes. And maybe we'll actually have the opportunity to do that, and in some other way, of course. But I just wanted to sort of reflect a little bit, and we were asked to think about this from the point of view of our role as journalists. And I will say, and maybe this gets to Leif's very kind introduction of Retraction Watch, I play a little bit of I guess a different role. Obviously, I'm a journalist, but I sort of think very in a focused way about these issues. So some of what I'm reflecting on does reflect what I'm thinking as a journalist. Some of it just reflects what I'm thinking of as someone who has thought about this area a lot. So forgive me if it's a bit scattershot, but hopefully there are at least a couple of things to reflect on. And the first is just to sort of, again, I think this came up in the last panel. It's come up throughout the days that we've been here, very rich days, that there is sort of obviously an ecosystem, a food chain. I don't know what the right metaphor is, but a sort of pathway by which research is, of course, transmitted to the public. Journalists are only one part of that, and I think that's really important. And I wish I could say that we were the most critical and important part of that, and we're not always. And I think that it's important to think about the role of press releases, important to think about the role of embargoes, which I've unfortunately been thinking about much too long, and I mean media embargoes, in terms of headlines and really what the role universities and funders and what have you play there. But one of the things that really struck me about some of the conversations, and maybe even some of the more, if you will, difficult or challenging conversations that have been had, particularly, frankly, the last panel, is this sort of idea that we should all be, or that scientists are all asking everyone, and by everyone I mean mostly people who are not researchers, who are not scientists, whether they be journalists, whether they be policymakers, whether they be the general public, to trust the system. And I think that there's a lot built into that is based, frankly, on if not false assumptions, then at least false experience, if you will. And so what do I mean by that? Again, apologies for referring to some notes here. Obviously, I focus mostly on misconduct and fraud. I mean, those are the most interesting stories. We do try very hard, and I hope we're succeeding in pointing out sort of plans and models and good behavior. We actually have a whole award and a whole category called Doing the Right Thing, which some of you have actually been entered into that category and what have you. But I don't think that it's a good idea to leapfrog all of what I would think of as small stuff. And I would include fraud and misconduct in that. I know that sounds strange given how much I think about that. But this sort of like, well, yeah, fraud is this thing that happens over there. And it's good that somebody's paying attention to it. We've got to focus on the system. You have to do both. If you just leapfrog and go to the system, you actually, I don't think, solve every problem. I mean, nothing's going to solve every problem, but I think you're not going to be as effective as you'd like. You have to have some level of granularity. And I want to sort of say that by way of introducing the fact that one of the things I noticed a lot, and Jevin West, actually, I think it was filter bubble, echo chamber. I know those are different terms or whatever, but the sort of concept there is everyone needs to get out of it, maybe even only in service of granularity and thinking about what people in other fields are doing. One of the great things about retraction, about doing Retraction Watch, is that I get to be an expert in absolutely nothing, and sort of a millimeter deep and several kilometers wide. So that I can't, I don't actually ever adjudicate. I mean, never call for retraction. I never adjudicate. Yes, this paper's good, bad. These findings are reproduced. I hope you've never heard me saying that, because I try my best not to. I talk about the process. But one of the things that it allows me to do is to see everything that's happening, not everything, but a lot of things that are happening in many, many fields. And one of the things that struck me here was that often someone would be here, giving a talk and say, hey, who's heard of X? So I think Steve Goodman got up and asked about Pecori. And then there were a number of people who'd heard of Pecori. The fact that the Begley paper, which I know got roundly criticized just now, Begley and Ellis paper, in Nature, to me, that's so old hat that I don't even talk about it anymore because it's just in the firmament. And yet I get the sense that wasn't necessarily something. I mean, people felt the need to include slides on it. John Carlisle, I'd love it if he was somehow involved in this somehow. Again, Pecori, James Heathers was up on the slide with a slightly snarky tweet, I think. But the work he and Nick Brown are doing, David Allison, who's here, is doing a lot of similar, again, broadly speaking in terms of statistical anomalies. Elizabeth Bick, who actually, I think she's in the Netherlands at the moment, but lives here in Palo Alto, doing this kind of work with image manipulation detection. I could go on, and I'd be happy to, afterward or following up, sort of talk about what I think of as everyone sort of should understand that other fields have been through this, and I know that this is actually more global, but I think it. And Brian, please correct me, but I think there's what I would think of in terms of, if you would think of all of research, an overrepresentation of psychologists because of who everyone knows and who's been sort of really active in this space. But anesthesiology has been dealing with this for actually arguably longer than any of you have. And actually, there's a guy here on campus, Steve Schaefer, who's on our board and who I had lunch with yesterday, who would be great to sort of connect with. And so I would just, maybe I'll sort of, that's my big picture message is, take a look at what everybody else is doing. I think you'll just learn a heck of a lot, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel and all of that stuff. It just seems like a good idea. I mean, test it. It's not always going to be relevant, but don't assume that it's never happened before. And I'll just close by sort of making a little bit of a plea, which is the same kind of analysis, the same kind of processes you're putting in place, the same kind of rigor and all of that, that you're applying to replications of the work itself and of the research itself and reproducibility. I would love it. I would love to see that applied to the actual investigation process for fraud and misconduct, which is one that needs a heck of a lot more sort of inspection and scrutiny than Adam and I and Allison Wrightis at Retraction Watch are ever going to be able to do, or frankly, all of us times 10 or 100 are ever going to be able to do. You folks, I think, are really well placed for that. We have the investigation reports for a number of cases, and would love to see people take a look at that. So that's my sort of maybe more small plea, but to end on. So, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Ivan. Can you hear? Oh, there I am. So I think a lot about how the public views science. I mean, as journalists, we're really sort of on the front lines of communicating science to the public. But I also want to point out that we are not boosters of science. And what I've come to realize is that there are a lot of people that don't understand the distinction between science communication and science journalism, and the four of us on stage are all journalists, and that means that we are not just communicators of science, but we are also watchdogs, and it's really our job to put truth to power and to hold organizations, institutions, and sort of, the institution of science, I guess, accountable. And so I think that we do have a really important role to play in this discussion. All four of us on stage have had some sort of role in uncovering, problems with science, things like this. I mean, Retraction Watch, obviously. Stephanie was very involved in sort of the downfall of Wayne Sick. I mean, not to say it was all you, but I, in the course of researching my book, which is about sports science, I started noticing that all of these problems that I've been reporting on in psychology were also endemic in sports science, and perhaps even more so. No one was talking about it, though, and when I tried to raise the question, people were really, frankly, very resistant to it. I was sort of not welcome. It was not a welcome conversation, and in the course of my reporting, I kept finding this statistical method that was being used. Steve Goodman talked about this, and it looked like it was being presented as an alternative to p-values, which on the surface sounded interesting and possibly promising, but I am not a trained statistician. But looking at this, I thought, this does not make any sense. I don't think this is right, but I don't know. And so I brought it around to some what are they called, Kristen? Establishment statisticians. The first two or three just sort of laughed me off. In fact, I brought it to Steve, and he said, this is nonsense. It's not even worth debunking. But then I brought it to Kristen Sanini, who's here sitting in the front, who is a trained statistician, took it up, ended up getting so riled up along with me, it was great, that she wrote a scientific paper about it. I wrote about it for 538, and my story was really about the culture of science and what was it that had allowed this clearly erroneous statistical method. So basically what had happened was this guy had invented, and I really do mean invented, this was a series of Excel spreadsheets that you had to download from his website. It had absolutely no theoretical basis. I mean, look, if you're doing your statistics in Excel, you're already doing something wrong. But it had become, this was someone who had a lot of eminence in the field, and he was very convincing. He also had a lot of status. And I think that, it's really important to look at this as science is done by human beings, and human beings are fallible. I mean, there was a great talk yesterday Dorothy gave about human biases. And, we're all human and we're all subject to these. And so it's really our job as journalists to sort of look at that and hold people accountable. And we're also, I am constantly looking for ways in which, whatever conclusions I'm coming to could be wrong. I'm looking for the contrary view. I have started, Brian Nosek actually suggested this to me at one point, and it's become a regular part of my repertoire of questions that I ask people. But when I'm doing an interview with someone, I now ask, how could you be wrong? What are the things that you are less sure of? What are the things that you're more certain about? And that sort of gets me to another really important point, and that is that I think that the public, we saw some slides yesterday showing that the public actually does have a lot of trust in science sort of as an institution and as a process, but I don't think that they have a good understanding of it. I don't think that the public really understands that science is a process. It's not an absolute answer, and that science sort of reduces uncertainty. It does not create certainty, and there's a difference there. And I think the more that we can present science as a process and as something that, where uncertainty is a feature of it and it's not a reason to dismiss it. I wrote a story for 538. The headline was something like, there's no such thing as sound science. And the sound science is sort of in air quotes. But this idea that the public has that there's good science and bad science, or that it's possible to sort of, be able to figure this out. And of course, there are varying degrees of rigor, obviously. But this notion the public has that science is a magic wand, it turns everything it touches to truth is really dangerous because it sort of gives fodder to these vested interests who are trying to take down inconvenient science. And so if the public doesn't understand that uncertainty, is normal in science, then you can have an entity come in and say, look, we found some uncertainty, therefore, the whole enterprise is for naught. The media often gets sort of blamed for some of this, and we get blamed for these headlines that are hypey, but there's very good evidence that a lot of this hype does not originate with the media. It actually originates in the press releases, with the institutions, with the journals. And I'll also just say, there are a lot of really good science journalists out there working today who are not going to improperly hype things. But the things that get improperly hyped, those are the journalists who aren't trained in science or whatever, but they're picking up on, that hype is almost always originating with the press release. It's astounding, too, the extent to which scientists are willing to hype their own research. So, stop blaming us. It's not just us. But I think that we're sort of, in a way, there is a sense in which we're in this together and trying to explain science in a better way and explain the problem here. I think the essential problem is that the public wants answers, we want answers, studies produce results, and those two are not the same. And I think it's really important that we make that distinction and that we understand that a result is not the same as an answer, and any particular study can only answer what is true for those very, very particular conditions and that time and space and all of that. And so the more that we can emphasize this and the more that we can think about this as sort of a feature of science, I think that the better off we'll all be. And I think I will hand it over to Richard now because I know he has some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, thanks, Christie. I decided that instead of sort of writing something up in advance, I would tend to try to digest the conference as it went along. And I must say, my belly is so full, my digestion is extremely incomplete. So my thoughts are probably not entirely coherent right now. But there was obviously a lot going on here, so much food for thought that will take some time. But let me highlight a few things that have sort of bubbled up in that process. And one is just sort of stepping back. When I wrote my book, which was published in 2017 and essentially finished writing in 2016, this world was already starting to take form in a serious way. And I made some serious efforts in my book, not just say this is not a laundry list of problems, but this is a recognition that people are now addressing. And it's really gratifying to see how much that has moved ahead, even in just a few years. And I quoted Steve Goodman in the book earlier on saying, these change does happen. And we talked about how much clinicaltrials.gov really fixed, or not entirely fixed, but address some very serious problems with clinical medicine. And so the idea is there's a nice model for you can actually make a big difference if you frame things, if you figure out the right way to move forward. So I keep coming back to that and thinking about that. And I've heard a lot of echoes of that at this meeting right now. So that's, it's you don't know what's going to be easy and flip over and become so automatic that people don't even remember they weren't doing it before. But I think there are lots of ideas that are bubbling along there. I think another thing that I came away from and was emphasized today in some of the comments of Chinita this morning was that that I understand a lot of where you are focusing your attention is tools to understand sort of internally what's going on in science, what's wrong, and sort of a theoretical framework. And where I am right now is my job is partly to cover the process of science and to do reporting about that, but most of my reporting is actually about results. And I have every day to confront a paper that's coming out in a journal deciding, is this right? How much time do I spend digging into the methodology? How much time do I spend, adding the caveats? And, and how do I know how to portray this in the spectrum that Christie was mentioning, which is nothing is like the answer, but it's like, where does this get us? What direction are we heading in? And one thing that I encourage you to think about is whether there are some tools that can emerge out of metascience that can be used, that can be focused on people who are not in science, but who are trying to make use and understand the material that comes out of science. So I don't, that's a half-formed thought, but I think that if you can think of sort of applications that will help society better grapple with these things and find truth from non-truth and so on. One small idea comes to mind. I talked to Jonathan Kimmelman some time ago, who suggested every paper ought to have a scientist at the end ought to say, somehow or other quantify how firm they feel about their own results as a way of judging. This is a 10 on my scale or whatever. I don't know what if he had an actual scale, but that sort of idea of maybe there's a way of helping those of us who are consumers of this material figuring out, how to digest it, how to portray it, how to put it in proper balance. So I hope that can come out of this conversation as well as you move forward and thinking about application. I think it is true that, I was careful in my book, when I ever talked about the replication crisis, that was always in quotes, and I think I only used that phrase once or twice because it's not a crisis. I think we agree that this is an awareness of something that is part and parcel of science, and we just need to think about it more clearly and in a different way, and not as a crisis, but as a part of the process that needs to be refined and improved. And I think it is gratifying to see that you're all moving in that direction. And I also think the last point, even though the last panel we heard from seemed to be night and day from what was going on, I think in the end, there's actually, I think I talked to a couple people at the break quickly, and there's a sense that there's actually much more agreement than the tone suggests between these two. And one thing that struck me was that how much we've all been talking and thinking about the underlying cultural issues, because that's really where the solutions are going to come from, right? You have to understand a lot of this really does come to the culture of science and how you make these institutional changes to change the incentives and so on. And these are enormous issues, but I think that fundamentally, even though that was, I guess, that's a critique panel, I think that they were landing on some issues that I've heard so much about over the last 4 days, and far earlier than that as well. So I think that I think we do need to, in the end, focus mutually on these cultural issues and on these institutional issues, because that's really the way forward. So with that, I will pass the baton.
Hi, everybody. I just want to say thanks again for having me at this conference. It's been so interesting, and I've met so many great people here, and all the talks have been so great. So some of the themes that have come up a lot are, is the replication crisis, if we call it a crisis, or replication movement. Is it a result of a dispute between bad actors or bad systemic incentives? Like what needs to change exactly, and what are the safeguards currently in place against shoddy science, and are they working? And a lot of this has made me reflect on my own experience reporting on the Cornell Food and Brand Lab, and it's just, I guess, one example, but I think it taught me a lot about how, at least in that case, the safeguards against shoddy science failed, like full stop, throughout the whole process. And so if it's instructive, just walking through the story again, for those who may not be familiar, can maybe shed light on where we are now and what we can do about it moving forward. So Brian was in charge of the Cornell Food and Brand Lab, which produced, I guess, very fun, buzzy, intuitive sounding advice, seemingly based on science, about how we eat and how we think about eating. I'm sure you've heard about some of his findings over the years, which were that you eat more from a endlessly refilling soup bowl, that women weigh more when their cereal is kept on their kitchen counters versus in the cupboards, that you eat more off a larger plate than a smaller plate. And these findings made him very famous in the media, but also like a very successful scientist by all metrics. His H index was 80. He'd been cited 30,000 times. He'd written 200 articles. He had funding from the NIH and the USDA. He ran this national program that gave schools advice about how to set up their cafeterias so kids would eat in healthier ways. So by all these I guess, conventional metrics. He was a very good researcher and scientist. And it all kind of imploded starting at the end of 2016 when he wrote a blog post about some of his work. I don't know if some people here maybe have read the blog post, but he basically said, we set out to do this experiment in a pizza restaurant, and the experiment failed. But my unpaid, hardworking graduate student from Turkey was able to take the data and turn it into 4 published studies that ended up in journals and got a lot of media attention. And after he put up that blog post, a lot of people started saying, this doesn't seem great. And and started looking more closely at these papers. And the people who did most of this work, although there were certainly others, were Nick Brown, James Heathers, Jordan Anaya, and Tim Vanderzee. And they got together and looked at these 4 particular papers, found a bunch of errors, wrote to the journals, wrote to the lab, wrote to Cornell, and the papers were corrected or retracted, and Cornell looked at it and said there were errors but not misconduct, and case closed. And that was the spring of 2017, and the story seemed to be over, but over the summer, papers kept getting retracted or corrected, and I would see this being posted on Retraction Watch and such, and I was like, so this lab's still operating, but there seems to be so much more here. What's really going on? And the lab was not talking to the media at all anymore. So I requested through public records laws, I requested emails between the Cornell lab and other researchers they've worked with across the country. And it gave me this window into how these researchers had been talking about their work for years. And what came up was just, there was p-hacking, but there were data impossibilities, there were sample sizes that didn't add up, there was missing data, there were very poorly conceived studies, there was very irresponsible data collection, there were attempts to look to mine huge data sets for literally anything that seemed like an interesting story. One collaborator said, I ran 400 mediation analyses and I still couldn't find anything in a data set. So I started writing these stories in the summer, fall of 2017, and for a while, Cornell stuck to its story, which was that they declined to comment, or they were concerned, but they weren't changing from their previous position, which was that the case was closed. And then finally, at the end of that year, they said, okay, we're going to do a full investigation into his work. So to date, he ended up being found guilty of academic misconduct. He resigned/retired 3 months ago. He's got 17 retractions. One of them was retracted twice. There's at least 20 corrections or expressions of concern. The lab is disbanded. And I guess the whole experience taught me that I guess the conclusion was satisfactory to those in this community, but what had allowed him to get that far? What allowed him to go all that way? And it was just, to me, again, a failure of so many safeguards that were supposed to hold scientific practices as his accountable. So peer review, I guess it's widely acknowledged here that peer review has flaws, and I saw peer review comments that people sent in for the papers, and they didn't notice what turned out to be later huge glaring errors. Journals published all this, obviously. A lot of them took a very long time to respond to criticism. Some have still never returned my emails asking what they're going to do about some of these papers. Funders funded the work and I guess liked what was being produced and apparently didn't look too closely at the details. People in the lab, for the most part, seemed to have gone along with how they were being instructed, and a lot of them became successful as a result of it. Cornell itself did did a preliminary review and decided the case was closed, and then didn't look into it more until there was more, I guess, media scrutiny and public pressure later. And so in the media, which, the media plays a role in this too, there's hype that, whether the source of it, I guess we can talk about. But for years, the media covered Brian's work extensively. He went on all the talk shows and made magazine covers, and reporters did not look closely enough at the work that they were covering along the way. And so just for years, this continued until this blog post came out, and then people started taking a closer look and immediately finding that there were huge problems. So was it bad actors or bad incentives? I guess you could argue there was perhaps both here. In terms of incentives, this is a very extreme example, I acknowledge, of a response to incentives. And the incentives, as we've discussed at length here, are the need to publish, the need to get hired, the need to get funding, et cetera, the need to get media coverage. And the Food and Brand Lab responded in a very extreme way to those pressures, but I don't think there's anybody here that can say they're immune from them. So it's both. And this all started only getting fixed when people outside the system, quote unquote, were willing to be critical of what they saw. So there's been discussion here about what it means to be civil and what is the line between, pointing out errors and how far do you take it, and is this getting into personal attacks, and what does it mean to be polite? And I don't have the best answer, but this really only started changing when people took it upon themselves to say this doesn't look right, and the usual channels are not responding to it, so we need to escalate. So I guess if there's a takeaway from this, in light of all the great discussions that's been happening here this weekend, I would say that if you see something that is wrong, that is happening, and it's not getting fixed, I would urge you to say something about it.
Say something.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think that this really speaks also, I think all of us, I cover a lot of different kinds of science, and so it kind of gives me a little bit of a window in the cultural differences between different fields. And what I've noticed is that there are practices that are perfectly acceptable in one field that aren't in another. And that doesn't mean that it's correct. And we could argue all day about how you even defined what correct is, but it really, these practices can vary a lot, and they're dynamic, and it can be, for a long time, certain practices in psychology were acceptable. They're no longer acceptable. And I think that nutrition science is undergoing a similar thing. At 538, I wrote a story. I think when people complain about the media, one of the examples they always bring up is coffee. One day it's good for you, one day it isn't, or these nutritional studies that make headlines. Well, those studies are all crap. They are universally crap. They really are. And I started. It was bugging me too. And so I started looking at them, and it turns out that these are all almost universally based on self-reports. We know that the data is unreliable. So you're basically taking large data sets of garbage and finding stuff in it, and it's no wonder that they're not reliable. And so, at 538, I did a project there. I wrote about it, but we also sort of made this tool where we were looking for spurious correlations in these data. We actually collected some of our own data, and we were able to show that potato chips were correlated with math ability. One of my favorite correlations that we found was that people who cut the fat off their steak were more likely to be atheists than people who ate that fat that God had given to them. But it was really, this was just, we basically used the research methods that were acceptable, that were the basis of thousands of studies in the literature to show this is yeah, you shouldn't believe this, and this is not reliable. And so, I don't know that, nutrition, it's not an accident that bad methods or sort of unreliable methods become fixed. usually that happens when you're studying a really difficult problem. And I think psychology is a really good example of this. Lisa sort of presented in her talk about all these different variables that can lead to different results. And like, that's real and that's good, but we shouldn't, if results are so variable, we should not be presenting them as answers, right? And I think that's where things really go wrong in terms of bringing this stuff to the public. But I think that science can probably do a better job too itself of like, you're not getting into that territory where they're overselling the results. I mean, we have entire departments at very good universities that are devoted to science that's just not really, probably not even worth doing. Because of the methodology that they're using. And this is another thing that I saw a lot in sports science. And it's kind of exciting to me because there's now a movement within sports science that's modeled on SIPs, actually. All of the stuff that I was seeing that was so similar to the problems that have been identified and called out in psychology are existing in these sports and exercise studies as well. But now there's actually a movement to sort of address them. And it's not going to be easy. They face particular problems and challenges, just like psychology did, but just because it's hard to do and expensive to do good science, that isn't an excuse for just like putting garbage out there. So it's tricky stuff, but I think that culture is a really important factor here, and it's something that needs to really be addressed and considered when we're talking about solutions.
If I could say something somewhat related to that, which is one thing that I was thinking about when I wrote my book was I started to go out and try to find sociologists who are actually studying what was happening within science in that way. And a lot of the social scientists in science were actually dealing with highly theoretical issues. And it's like trying to understand the intellectual framework and all important issues. But there really were so few people studying behavior within science. And I hope that is starting to change with this movement that and obviously we saw some examples of it here, but it was so frustrating. It's like, because one thing a reporter wants to do is like, let's find an expert who's, used some careful methodology and thought about this stuff. And so I don't have to shoot from the hip or just talk to people who have these impressions. What do the data say about these behaviors within science? And it was so much lacking just a few years ago. And now the glimmers that are coming out of this conference now are a hopeful sign. And so, yes, even though metascience is not a new thing, a lot of sort of the philosophy of science really has been, at least maybe I just missed the literature, but I think so much of the philosophy of science was based on looking at issues much more abstract, and it's nice to see the focus becoming on some of these more concrete issues, because I think that's ultimately the kind of thing that we need to get more of here.
It's all great. Thank you all. One of the things that, so returning to a metaphor that Ivan introduced, this idea of there being like a food chain of the dissemination of knowledge from the researchers all the way up through the journalists. One of the themes of these stories of, like, I think Stephanie reporting on and Brian Wansink is you say, gosh, why did no one notice this before? And then finally it comes out and you're like, well, that's good that we learn more. For both the good and for the bad, I'm curious what your thoughts are on what are ways we can make the food chain better. Like, what is it that if I'm me as a scientist or as a meta-scientist, what are the things that I could do that would make sure that the most valuable content got out there, or that if I'm concerned and I think someone else is putting bad content out there, that it'll be caught? Do you think there are things that scientists or institutions can change to sort of make that food chain work better?
I mean, I do. I mean, I teach journalism at NYU. I teach in a specialized program, and probably many of you in the audience have spoken to my former students or students of the program. It's science, health, environmental reporting. And one of the things that is obviously I'm quite concerned about is the relationship between university press offices and journal press offices and this embargo thing, which, by the way, just to be clear, there's embargoes on, somebody mentioned, I think earlier today, the 12-month embargo on whether this study was open access. That's actually not what I'm talking about. I mean, happy to talk about that too, but I'm talking about the media embargo, right? And you've all done this in some way. You've been part of it. Someone, today, what's today? Today is Sunday.
Yeah.
So on Friday, I know what's going to be in the New England Journal of Medicine at 5 p.m. that's going to be released at 5 p.m. I think all of us may not know because we may not care that much, but we,
I have not opened that email.
I try not to
haven't.
do a single study story, so.
it's in our inbox. And so and here's where I get a little bit wonky, but I hope this crowd will permit me for a second. The embargo itself, which is the 5 days or whatever it is, Friday afternoon we got an email about New England Journal of Medicine, 5 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday is when it'll come out. So it gives us some time to report on these studies and hopefully actually include some nuance, some context, some outside comment. If that was the whole kit and caboodle of what embargoes did, that would not be awful. I probably still wouldn't love it, but there are lots of things I don't love, right? So fine, that's not the real problem. The real problem is that, and please, correct me here, stand up and correct me and tell me that I'm wrong so that I can stop making this stump speech everywhere I go. I have other things to do, but journals make it very clear, even if they pretend not to make it clear, that if you, as a member of, as a researcher, want to be published in those journals, and I know this is different in some fields, they're going to be much more likely to accept your paper, or at least take it seriously, put it through proper peer review and all that, if you haven't talked about it to someone like one of us on this stage, or any reporter, or had any kind of publicity about it. And again, I'm oversimplifying because journals claim they don't do this. Some journals actually don't do this, which is wonderful, but New England Journal isn't exactly among them. And so, the point is, you then are all worried about talking to people like us, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about your results than you're comfortable with or than the journal might be comfortable with. And all of a sudden, guess what? You don't get to publish that paper, which means you don't get tenure. I'm oversimplifying to death here, but I think you all know what I'm talking about. If we can get rid of that behavior, which again, some journals are starting to at least talk about getting rid of, and some have actually gotten rid of, I know that's not, one solution is not going to solve more than one maybe problem, but the point is that prevents us, so where I'm going to do with this, that prevents journalists, or it makes it, I should say, extremely challenging for journalists to talk about science the way it really happens, as opposed to these punctuated moments when something appears in the journals, right? And because, as you all know, science happens, medical science happens at 5 p.m. on Wednesday afternoons Eastern. I don't know if you realize that. That's actually what's happening. It didn't happen in a lab somewhere or out in a clinic somewhere years before or months before or who knows what. And so there's this completely artificial, I think, amplification of the idea that it's results are the only thing we care about, and we don't care about the process, and it looks like journalists don't. But anyone who's ever tried to go up to someone at a conference and talk about their results after, or about their presentation, I should say. There, I just did it, results, right? So anyone tries to talk about a presentation and they see that, they took off our name tags because they would interfere with the picture taking. But the point is, they see that I'm from, they say I'm from Retraction Watch. They're definitely running away. So funny, we started, never mind. Anyway, I get it, it's fine. But it says New York Times, it says NPR, it says BuzzFeed. I don't want to talk to you because. So I think that there's just, and again, that's one little thing, but it's a symptom of the larger problem of treating everything as if it's just beyond. And if I may, just very quickly, on the sort of food chains probably. I'm terrible at metaphors. Ask my students. Like I start them in class, and it's like, oh my God, what am I talking about? So food chain's probably not right, and that was my fault for even putting it in your head. But the end of this process, or the sort of one other point in the cycle of this process is, and it gets back to I think what Christie was saying about reflecting on some of what we heard about being polite or sort of whether or not it's okay or a good idea to criticize others' work. And I think we all would agree it's not okay to criticize the person, but criticizing work, I'm sorry, like if you're not doing that, I'm not quite sure. And what was really interesting to me about the last panel was apparently let's criticize work in private. Let's rip the hell out of every paper in Journal Club. But no, we don't go and do that in public. And I'm sorry, what I think Stephanie was, not to oversimplify, but what Stephanie was describing about the Wansink case, what I've seen day after day after day is that very little happens when there isn't public scrutiny of a lot of these findings that, frankly, we all know. Even when there is public scrutiny, sometimes something doesn't happen. But that is, I think, in many ways what changed, and it's really Stephanie's reporting that changed, the narrative of that had an effect on the outcome of that story and of that narrative. And so if as a community you're not willing to do that, I actually don't believe when people say that science, the self-correction process in science works. I don't, because I see the evidence is quite opposite of that. And so, be willing to criticize. And this group tends to be, at least, I talk to a lot of you or know you and see your work. Maybe making sure that's a comfortable place for everyone would be a good thing.
That's great. I want to actually return to something. Oh, yeah, Christie had said, she said part of the job of a journalist is to hold the institution of science accountable. And I think it's interesting, and so maybe this panel is almost uniquely the most poorly suited for this in that you already do that. But I would say, in general, science journalists, I'm not sure that that's what they would think of as part of their job. And I'm curious, how can that be more of it? Whereas I'd say journalists in politics or in other domains, that's naturally what they're going to go to, is they're going to report on finding the seamy underbelly of some other narrative. But somehow science journalism has some of that, this panel, of course, but a lot of it's absent. Do you have thoughts on ways to sort of inject more of that into sort of day-to-day reporting?
When I started, so I don't have a science background, and when I somehow got hired to cover science and health, I was told to think of it as like politics, which is not to say you're all politicians,
Yeah.
but I mean, people receive money. The money is used in certain ways. It's often taxpayer money. That should be like the way in which it's used should be scrutinized. People in the system should be looked at. So to me, it's never. I mean, I think the scientific process is incredibly interesting, and there's fascinating discoveries that get made and published every day. But to me, that's never been. I've not approached it with a sense of inherent awe. I guess I approach it with a bit of like scrutiny and outsider perspective, just because I didn't work in a lab or something, during college. And so I think as more stories like ours come to the front of the conversation and others read them, I think other journalists, are seeing that they should also be treating science as not just, inherently correct, and it's just, the challenge is just to convey the terminology in exactly the right way, but there should be a larger look at the institutions that fund and produce it.
Can I go a little meta on this? Which is that, I think, well, first of all, there clearly is a watchdog role for journalists, but also, let's not forget, what was it, $2 trillion a year spent on research? And we, the public, spend that money and other institutions because we want the fruits of that. So I think that it's natural for journalists to focus on, here's what you're getting in exchange for paying your taxes and so on. And I think that's a very important role we play in addition to being watchdogs. For me, I guess a lot of the critique in my understanding of science isn't necessarily just doing stories about things that are broken in the process of science, but understanding where the weaknesses are. So when I'm reading a paper, I know, how or I try to figure out how certain or uncertain to be, and how much skepticism to inject into it, when it's appropriate to call a statistician when a paper comes out, and those sorts of. So I think other science journalists do that more than actually reporting on bad behavior and things like that. But I think that really good science journalists do think about these process issues, but they use it as part of their craft as opposed to part of their reporting. That's my meta part.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I'll let the audience ask. And for my friends in the audience, they'll know this is sort of a personal crusade of mine. So Metascience, either the conference or the concept, is based on either belief or skepticism of science. Now we think about it, and it all sort of takes for granted that it is worth endeavoring more. And it leaves behind a critical topic of simple outright fraud and fabrication, where that's not, we don't want to do a statistical correction for making up data. You want to eliminate the made up data. And I would say, observationally, as an academic, we're really bad at finding and adjudicating anything related to fraud in many, many levels. And here I kind of would like your insights for maybe what journalists could do, but I'd be super psyched even if you said, this is what I think scientists should be doing to reduce the amount of fraud that is prevalent in science, or to identify where it is and move on and so on.
So I think, I mean, I'm gonna give the sort of the meta big answer because I think we have to start there, but I'm gonna give it briefly because I think we all know this part, which is and Dan Finelli may actually jump up and say I'm wrong here, but I having watched this for a number of years now, I'm quite convinced that the incentive structure is at least partially, more than partially responsible. So I'm just going to say that. I'm also going to say I don't have an answer for that. So let's just sort of tick at the box and then I'll move on. I think, you know, the thing about the thing about fraud is that, in fact, a lot of it has become easier to detect. Now, I'm not going to claim that it's not also true that you're always fighting last year's battle, last year's war. So, you know, people come up with things. You know, for example, we were the first to report on what sounds like a sort of silly kind of fraud, which was fake peer review, right? So people actually managing to, they create fake email addresses, and then they submit, you know, Brian Nosek, I think, would be a great reviewer on my paper. And so the editor looks at that and says, oh, yeah, Brian Nosek, I'd love to get him to review for my journal, and sends an invitation, except that what I've actually done is, you know, bnosek@gmail.com. Sorry if that isn't your email, but, you know, and, you know, I made that up this morning so that when the invitation comes in, I peer review my own paper, which is awesome. Don't try it at home because they've now fixed that vulnerability, thanks, sorry, to reporting from Retraction Watch. But the point is, okay, that's done. Nobody really should get away with that anymore. We're always fighting last year's battle. But I think, and this gets back to what I was trying to say at the beginning, there's a sort of, and I totally get the instinct and actually support the effort to predict what might be retracted at some other point. There's all these papers. So we have 20,000 retractions in our database now. Sorry, it's about 19,800 to be precise. It's more than anyone else. You can go to retractiondatabase.org and look at all of them. It's open and all that. But that is probably roughly, you know, and this is being conservative, you know, a fifth of the number that should be in that database. And so, like, we aren't even at a point where we need to start thinking about how to reduce fraud. I think we're still at a point where we need to, like, actually use the tools that I started to mention, and I'm happy to give you a list of all the kinds of people who are working on this, just to find it and to figure it out and to be willing to talk about it. And again, this is where I get back to, also the final thing I'll say is, like, and this actually came up in the last session. I thought it was a very interesting comment about, you know, and I'm totally paraphrasing / mangling this, but it was some version of, you know, one day you will all be in charge kind of comment, if I was getting it right. Some of you are already in charge. And I like lawyers as much as the next person, but let's not let lawyers run universities, okay? Because when lawyers run universities, no one ever commits fraud, which is the opposite of what's actually happening, because they tell you nobody commits fraud. They could tell you the list of bad actors in many countries, particularly in the U.S., where apparently no one commits fraud until you have to settle, you know, a $112.5 million lawsuit. Well, you still don't admit that you committed fraud because someone actually committed what's clearly scientific misconduct. So denial ain't just a river in Egypt. And if we start to, you know, if we start with that and sort of put the right people, and I think they're scientists actually, not lawyers, in charge of, you know, that sort of administrative power, I think we might be better off.
Thinking about the way in which scientific misconduct gets reported, or how people, like what options people have for reporting it, there's just a lot of issues with that system. So I guess if today if you were like, something's going wrong at this lab on my campus, who would you tell? I guess you would tell somebody at the university, and, you know, a university may or may not be super motivated to look into flaws in research produced by like one of their star people. There's I'm sure, I assume you guys are familiar with the Office of Research Integrity, which oversees NIH and taxpayer-funded research. The first step when they get a scientific misconduct allegation is that they ask the home institution to investigate it. So like, if that happened at Stanford, if there was a claim about somebody at Stanford, the ORI would say, Stanford has to look at it first, then tell us the result, and then we'll decide if that was like an acceptably done investigation or not. Feel free to chime in if I'm getting the nuance of this wrong. But that is like a circular thing where, again, if the home institution and folks there are not willing to, may not always be inclined to rigorously, independently investigate what's going on their home turf. When whistleblowers move through the ORI complaint process, anonymity is not guaranteed. Actually, I think at a certain point you have to not be anonymous to participate in the investigation. So you can see why this is, again, not the greatest incentive for somebody to speak up about wrongdoing that they see. So I think that universities there needs to be a better way for people to flag things that they see are wrong. I guess journalists are one option. If you ever hear about anything, let us know. Let me know.
You can give us anonymous tips.
Yes. But yeah, I think that the whole system for reporting it is very confusing and fraught, and obviously people feel like they've got a lot on the line, so it's scary.
Yeah, I don't know. I've done a lot of reporting on doping in sport, and to me there are parallels here where like I think some of it comes down to culture too, and like what you need a culture that does not permit it and doesn't see it as acceptable and is willing to sort of out their own. And the graduate student who's seeing fraud or some sort of misconduct in the lab needs to be in a place where they feel comfortable talking to someone, and there's a culture that's supportive of that and that is supportive and very adamant about ethical behavior. And I think so much of what facilitates this is our cultural factors that allow it, and particularly when you are thinking about things like bullying or sexual harassment and things like this, which very often are, come hand in hand with other kinds of misconduct as well. So much of it comes down to the culture, and you really need a situation where it's not tolerated and there's a culture that won't stand for it.
And if I could just add one thing, I really want to emphasize the point about regarding the discussion about civility and politeness. I really can't emphasize enough how important it is that if you feel like something is wrong, to be able to like talk about it openly. I could not have done my stories; they would not have had the same impact if people like Kristen or Brian hadn't been able to weigh in on what I was reading about and explaining in very clear terms to readers why exactly this behavior was so problematic.
Great. Why don't we get some questions from the audience? We can start on the left side.
Lisa Feldman Barrett, psychologist, neuroscientist, curmudgeon of the moment, Northeastern University. So I really appreciate your comments, and I agree with pretty much everything everybody said, and particularly, Christie, I appreciated your point about, the issue of complexity and context should be, the people who published the original paper should be held accountable in that way too. And actually someone else made that point to me too. And I think that's an excellent, excellent point. And I guess it's the lead into that. That point is sort of a lead into my question, which is, I totally hear what you're saying and think it's an interesting point that your job isn't just to report on the science, it's also to hold people accountable in an investigative way, which I think is very cool and somewhat different from what scientists do when they speak to the public, which is really when we do, it's more, or at least when I do it, the almost entire motivation is to try to explain something about how science works, because people don't generally think about science as, for example, reducing uncertainty, that that's the goal and that you can never prove anything is true and so on and so forth. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, in the process of reporting, how much is it possible for you, or is it at all possible to also educate the public about how science works, how much is that also your task, or is it really more? So, for example, people report on politics, they don't explain how politics works, right? Or when they report on, or maybe they do. I don't know. I just don't understand it. But I mean, like, for example, I learn a lot about how, I'm not an economist, but I learned something about how economics works from reading, Paul Krugman's columns, for example, because he's often explaining things in addition to critiquing. And so, for example, this is it bad actors or bad incentives? I would say, well, many of us have mentioned the problematic incentive structure, really problematic incentive structure. Some of us have written about it. But I would also say that science is also not about simple single causes. There is a bad incentive structure, but not everyone responds to that incentive structure by doing bad things. And for some people, a little nudge is all they need. And for some people to do something bad, and some people, they need a lot before they'll do something bad. So the point being that this idea of how science works, how science is a social activity amongst social humans, how much of that is also your mandate as opposed to the accountability issue, I guess? Or are they distinguishable or the same?
I think they're sort of inseparable, aren't they? I mean, I don't know that I'd make that distinction.
I think that's what I'm asking. Is there a distinction, or is that, I mean, we might all be united, whether we're journalists by trade or not, in that effort? And is that worth thinking more about how to improve science literacy so people can understand what's happening more when there's a problem and when they read something that's claiming a finding.
Yeah, I think I agree with Christie. I try to do this all the time by, among other things, talking about the uncertainty. It's of a finding. I mean, honestly, if you put every conceivable caveat in a story, you have no time to tell the story, right? But it's finding that right balance and talking about the uncertainty, and this is, how likely is this to be true? How many other times has this been happening? And why any one study is not the final word, even though in daily journalism we are sort of forced into this thing that Ivan alluded to, which is reporting on a single study, which is not the way to go. But I'm not going to wait till there's study number 50 that has finally, convincingly concluded this, because, that's not news anymore. I'm sorry. That was, news was 20 years ago when study number 1 came out, or 2 or 3 or whatever. But so yeah, absolutely. I think it's our job to strike that right balance, which is why, which resonates with why I also am trying to get deeper insights from the meta-science world, not just about where bad behavior or whatever or problems are in this field, but how to think about that uncertainty and how to communicate that. I think that's a major way of doing that.
I want to add one thing, and that is I'm thinking a little bit about Samin's talk yesterday about credibility, and I think that approach to things is something that we as journalists use all the time and are always looking at, okay, how credible is this field? How credible is this sort of method or line of research? And so that's sort of one way of framing it, and there aren't good metrics, and there's no magic answer to that question, but it's something that we think about a lot. But I'll also just say that I think one of the most important decisions that I make as a journalist is deciding which studies to cover and which science. Very often the best decision that I can make, and I do, is to not write about a new study or to not cover this thing because it's not ready for prime time, or I don't think that it's credible or whatever. And so just because something's coming out in Science or Nature doesn't mean that it's worthy of news headlines. And I think that we need to more often make those decisions, not to write about those stories.
Yeah, but we also have terrible peer pressure, because I can make that decision, and then the morning edition editor will say, well, we want the story that was in the Washington Post. It's well, we skipped it because we didn't think it was any good. Well, we don't care why you skipped it. We want it. And so.
But then the story can become, and this is what I would do at 538. Okay, I see this study and I know it's not very good, but I also think that other people are going to cover it. So let's just wait. And then the story sort of becomes also a criticism of how it's being misrepresented, or how I did a story for 538 about a vaping study that was out. It was in a JAMA, I think it was JAMA Pediatrics. And it was just the methodology. It was a an internet survey, and like their conclusion was based on 6 responses. And so, I mean, it was that bad. And when I talked to the researcher, I was like, 6, and he was like, yeah, but it was statistically significant and it passed peer review. So, and I was like, oh, my head is exploding. But so I wrote the story, and it had gotten some headlines. But so the story then became like why this was not a good example, and this is a really important issue. It was about vaping in kids and whether it's going up or down, and so this was an important story. But this was not like this study was not an answer, right? It was a result, but it wasn't a result that was going to really inform an answer.
Hi, I'm Sydney Wood. I'm a student at UC Davis. And I was wondering so criticisms are hard, and they're hard to hear, and they hurt, and that's kind of true for everyone. But I was wondering if you have any insight or maybe even intuitions whether or not within the field of science, or as scientists, when we receive criticism from other scientists, so like taking the public out of it, when we are receiving those criticisms, do we respond worse than other fields where they're in a public eye, but also there's criticism within, so like journalists or politicians? You know, there's a lot of fields that are in the public eye, and there's a lot of cross criticisms within those fields to each other. And I was wondering if you had any insights on whether we respond worse than other fields to our own criticisms.
Well, politicians will just, pretend that it never happened.
No, it's the Sharpie method.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I actually, maybe this is such a glib thing to say that I shouldn't say it, but I'm about to say it. I mean, like, people are people, right? And so, I mean, I've reported on lots of different things, and to some extent, because I sort of look at clinical, medicine and healthcare policy in my day job, and I see so I interact with policymakers and wonks and politicians. Like, everyone is thinner skinned than they like to think they are, and I'm sure I'm the same way. Like, and that's I get it, and that's problematic. And I do think that there is some role for making it about the work and not the person. And so I do think that there has been, and again, I don't think that scientists are unique here. I think in general there has been a tendency to equate, to sort of dial it up and equate criticism of work or of a position with criticism of the person to score points with your followers, kind of thing, which has definitely happened in science, definitely happened in certain areas, also certainly happens in politics. Just that's what politics is. And I do think we need to watch that, but there's the sort of honest broker kind of idea that people have come up with. So I don't think that scientists are any different, but I do think it's something we have to pay attention to.
Hi, my name's Joseph Fridman. I work with Dr. Barrett on some communication stuff in the lab. I'm one of those boosters. I had a question about media forms and like the types of knowledge objects that y'all are producing. So this guy, John Durant, said that you can maybe think about science literacy on 3 levels. You have scientific facts, here's what the sun is. You have the scientific method, here's what the scientists did. And then you have how science really works, like all the stuff going on around it, who they're funded by. I wonder how each of those 3 translate to different types of like communications and different medium, basically. Y'all work in books, blogs, radio, internet first. Can you imagine like a better form? Some of those can accommodate scientific voices, scientific uncertainty in better ways than others. I'm really wondering, like, are we doing the best we can with the type of distribution and the type of thing that you make? Yeah, thanks.
I think so. Different stories are going to be told better in different ways. There's a lot of really great radio and podcasting being done right now on long form stories that are telling narratives that can really get into the cultural aspects of it and can get into the process stuff a lot more. Any kind of news story is going to be constrained by the fact that it's going to be short and it's going to be about a particular thing. But even there, Richard, you do a lot of news stuff, and there you're still putting it into context. So it's not just here's a new study, but like here's where it fits into what we already know. And you can think of this as one piece in the puzzle, where you're taking the totality of the evidence and not just one study in isolation.
One really small example of that is actually a slide that Paula Stefan put up yesterday. It was a story about the Nobel Prize, but I got the guy to talk about sort of the reality of how science works and how he'd failed for 5 years, et cetera. And so even in a case where you're doing a real news story about a real news event, I always look for ways to say, how can I bring some other element into it to help people understand not just this one thing, but the context? And that's just a small example.
I would just very quickly overlay another typography, if you will. It's not really typography, but which is how likely it is that whatever you're doing is going to reach a reasonably large audience. You can dive real deep in podcasts, and I don't want to get into podcast metrics, but they're a little dodgy. And so, we don't really know who's listening to that stuff, whereas we do know that, something goes viral and whatever. So that's a very, very superficial way to say it. But, I work in the trade press in my day job, and so we're never going to reach, what BuzzFeed or NPR is reaching, and that actually plays a big role in what we choose to do, but also just who actually gets it.
Hi, Steve Goodman. Two quick questions. One, how do you walk the line between feeding the science denialists and constructive criticism of science? I mean, you're really sophisticated, but you know this other world that's just looking to tear down science, and I think we all think that science actually does move forward, is making progress. So that's one question. The second is, what do you think you are sort of at the top of the heap. You're a real luxury that we scientists have to speak to and speak through. So many science journalists are not trained or as sophisticated as you. What do you think is, and they're being fired all over the place. I mean, everywhere, Washington Post, everywhere. What do you think is the future of the profession of having sort of full-time or close to full-time science reporters who actually understand everything that you understand and go to meetings like this?
That's a big question. How much time will we be employed?
So I'm going to take this one because I have it's an easier one to answer, frankly.
Which is saying a lot, right?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things, so Adam and I, Adam Marcus is my co-founder at Retraction Watch, we very early on, and this is the sort of lighthearted science denialists, if you will, so creationists, and they're calling themselves intelligent design. They loved us from day one. It was like, oh my God, see all these guys they're legit, and they come to conferences like this, and people listen to them, and they think peer review is pretty flawed, and they think that there's some room for improvement. And if they're saying that, clearly you can believe the biblical story instead of, and that's, I know I'm being glib and I'm saving time here for everybody else, but that's actually the argument, right? So what that taught us very quickly was that we were going to be, it reminded us that we were going to be sort of weaponized, if you will, as evidence, when we were the safe people to point to. And then that happened, of course, with autism vaccine stuff until they realized that was a problematic argument because, that paper was retracted, that sort of, they had to come up with another issue, climate change, yada, yada, all the issues. So what Adam and I started doing, because we actually do have a reasonably large megaphone, not just on Retraction Watch, but when we write for other news outlets, and lots of news outlets, we'll get quoted in lots of news outlets, was to insert a little bit of a poison pill in the middle of, whatever we were saying. Certainly if we were writing it, it was easier to control that. But, and we started with the sort of creationism stuff where it was like, peer-reviewed, we think is kind of a flawed process that needs a lot of work. However, this does not, or even M-dash, you couldn't quote the sentence without either being dishonest or including the phrase where we said, this does not mean that, creationism is correct, right? Sort of, I know that sounds like, why would you write that? So if you've ever read a column of ours and wondered, why the hell are you doing that?
Yeah.
Steve, thank you for letting me explain. And again, that's a glib, not glib, but just sort of superficial thing. But I think that if you're always thinking about that and anticipating the argument, and you do need a sophistication about that. I know this came up at the NAS meeting just a couple of years ago, and there was a lot of really interesting back and forth on that. You do need to anticipate that argument, and I would urge all of you to think about that too. But also don't do the deplatforming thing either, right? Because if you deplatform and you just sort of say, no one else can speak on this issue because we're the right ones, social science has shown convincingly that is going to only make things worse. there's a result, right? That they apparently, there's no uncertainty. See?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I'll just refer back to, I was talking about it earlier, the story I did for 538, which was explicitly about this. I mean, it starts off, I was basically looking at how this like anti-science movement is using some of the language of this movement of metascience and open science to try and, dismantle science. And but if you look at it, it can be difficult to distinguish. And I think the conclusion that I sort of came to while thinking about that piece, and it was called There's No Such Thing as Sound Science, but I think what I really sort of settled on was that really the solution here is that we need to just help the public understand more about uncertainty and that it is a feature of things, and helping people. I mean, the antidote to that is a public that understands that science is a process and is not viewing it as a dichotomy of true or false, but there's like more certain and less certain. And the more that we can continue to frame science that way, and that we can show that it's a process, and that we can be transparent. I mean, I think that scientists being more upfront, I mean, every time the scientist stands up there and, presents their result as an answer, like that's contributing to that problem. And so we need to stop doing that.
I just want to address the other question, which was, will we be employed in 10 years?
Who knows?
I don't know. I hope so. It's no secret that the media business is notoriously not the most stable, and it's like a scary time to be in the media. If you feel like the work we do is important, I would urge you to subscribe to things and pay for things and donate to things, because I feel like we play an important role in the ecosystem, and I'd like to continue having a job. I don't know.
Right.
Amen.
Well, thanks to all of our panelists, and thank you all for being here.